Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. A big thanks to BIC for hosting this panel discussion. So we'll have a panel discussion where each of the panelists will share a response to the book in about 10 to 15 minutes. So before that happens, MD Pallavi was fortunately back in town a day sooner than she was planning to be here, is going to sing B.M. Shree's translation of Lead Kindly Light, Karunalu Babelake. She told me over the phone that UR Ananthamurthy was especially fond of her rendering of that, this prayer by John Newman from the early 19th century. All of us know about this. And it's also a model of translation, actually, which hasn't been surpassed, I would think, from English to Kannada. After that, she has rendered a poem of UR Ananthamurthy into song, and we'll have her sing that as well. And after that, we'll move over to the panel discussion. A big thank you to all the panelists for making time to be here with us this evening. So this book took 4 years to put together. Not continuous time, but staggered time, nevertheless a lot of time. On the face of it, it seems a simple affair. Get together a few published work, things, and you put it together. But there was lots of decisions about what to choose, what not to choose, how to fix errors in translation if you ran into them, among many other decisions. Thank you to Manu, who was with me on this task. With that, I invite Pallavi to come and...
Namaskara. I think Chandan has said what I intended to say, that I'll be singing 2 songs, 2 poems, and the first one is B.M. Shree's Karunalu Babelake, Lead Kindly Light. And Ananthamurthy sir was very fond of this song, and he would always ask me to sing this for him whenever we met. So I'll be singing this one and a poem of his that I've composed. ಕರುಣಾಳು ಬಾಬೆಳಕೆ ಮುಸುಕಿದೆ ಮಬ್ಬಿನಲಿ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು ಕರುಣಾಳು ಬಾಬೆಳಕೆ ಮುಸುಕಿದೆ ಮಬ್ಬಿನಲಿ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು ಇರುಳುಗತ್ತಲೆಯ ಗವಿ ಮನಿದೂರ ಕನಿಕರಿಸಿ ಇರುಳು ಕತ್ತಲೆಯ ಗವಿ ಮನಿದೂರ ಕನಿಕರಿಸಿ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು ಕರುಣಾಳು ಬಾಬೆಳಕೆ ಮುಸುಕಿದೆ ಮಬ್ಬಿನಲಿ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು ಹೇಳಿ ನನ್ನಡಿ ಇಡಿಸು ಬಲುದೂರ ನೋಟವನು ಕೇಳೆನೊಡನೆಯೇ ಸಾಕು ನನಗೊಂದು ಹೆಜ್ಜೆ ಹೇಳಿ ನನ್ನಡಿಗಿಡಿಸು ಬಲುದೂರ ನೋಟವನು ಕೇಳೆನೊಡನೆಯೇ ಸಾಕು ನನಗೊಂದು ಹೆಜ್ಜೆ ಮುನ್ನ ಇಂತಿರದಾದೆ ನಿನ್ನ ಬೇಡದೆ ಹೋದೆ ಮುನ್ನ ತಿರದಾದೆ ನಿನ್ನ ಬೇಡದೆ ಹೋದೆ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು ಕರುಣಾಳು ಬಾಬೆಳಕೆ ಮುಸುಕಿದೆ ಮಬ್ಬಿನಲಿ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು. ಇಷ್ಟು ದಿನ ಸಲಹಿರುವೆ ಈ ಮೂರ್ಖನನು ನೀನು, ಮುಂದೆಯೂ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸದಿಹೆಯ. ಇಷ್ಟು ದಿನ ಸಲಹಿರುವೆ ಈ ಮೂರ್ಖನನು ನೀನು, ಮುಂದೆಯೂ ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸದಿಹೆಯ. ಕಷ್ಟದಡವಿಯ ಕಳೆದು ಬೆಟ್ಟ ಹೊಳೆಗಳ ಹಾದು, ಕಷ್ಟದಡವಿಯ ಕಳೆದು ಬೆಟ್ಟ ಹೊಳೆಗಳ ಹಾದು, ഇരുಳನ್ನು ನೂಕದಿಹೆಯ. ಬೆಳಗಾಗ ಹೊಳೆಯದೆಯೇ ಹಿಂದೊಮ್ಮೆ ನಾನೊಲಿದು, ಬೆಳಗಾಗ ಹೊಳೆಯದೆಯೇ ಹಿಂದೊಮ್ಮೆ ನಾನೊಲಿದು, ಈ ನಡುವೆ ಕಳಕೊಂಡ ದಿವ್ಯಮುಖನಗೂತ, ಕರುಣಾಳುವ ಬೆಳಕೆ ಮುಸುಕಿದೆ ಮಬ್ಬಿನಲಿ, ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು. ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು. ಕೈ ಹಿಡಿದು ನಡೆಸೆನ್ನನು. Thank you. And the second one is a poem of his, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಮೌನ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ ಹೊತ್ತು ತುಂಬಿದ ಹಾಗೆ. ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಮೌನ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ ಹೊತ್ತು ತುಂಬಿದ ಹಾಗೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಮೌನ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ ಹೊತ್ತು ತುಂಬಿದ ಹಾಗೆ, ಉಬ್ಬಿಯೋ ತಗ್ಗಿಯೋ ಸೊಟ್ಟಗೋ ನೆಟ್ಟಗೋ ಚಾಚುತ್ತ ಗುರಿ ಫಲಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವ ರಸ್ತೆಯ ಹಾಗೆ, ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಜ್ಞೆ, ಬೇರು ಮಣ್ಣು ಗೊಬ್ಬರ ಕಾಂಡಗಳ ಒತ್ತಾಸೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟು, ಹೂವಲ್ಲಿ ತನ್ನ ಪ್ರತ್ಯೇಕ ಪಡೆದಂತೆ ತೊಡಗಿದ್ದಾಗ ಇಕೋ ಎಂದು ಕಂಡಂತೆ, ಇಕೋ ಎಂದು ಪಡೆದಂತೆ ಹೊಕ್ಕಾಗ ಬರೀ ಒಂದು ಎಚ್ಚರದಂತೆ, ಬರೀ ಒಂದು ಅಚ್ಚರಿಯಂತೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನ ಹೊರೆ ನನ್ನ ದುಡಿಸು ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸು ಕಟ್ಟು ಒಕ್ಕು ಬಿತ್ತು ಬಿಡಿಸು ಬಿಡಿಸು ಕಾಣಿಸು ಕಾಣಿಸು. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. The first speaker on the panel is Gundur. Gundur is professor of English at Tumkur University. He has done a book to introduce Foucault's thoughts into Kannada, and is currently translating D.R. Nagaraja's posthumous work, Allama Prabhu Mattu Shaiva Pratibhe, into English. Gundur.
So good evening. Like Dr. URA, I am also a teacher. I am not comfortable sitting and talking. So we teachers, we need podium. And one more thing, we teachers, we can't come out of the class before 2 hours. But Chandan has given just 15 minutes. It's like a test player playing 2020, even not 2020, 10-10. So anyway, therefore, I straight away come to the point, and I'm extremely happy to introduce this book. First, I will introduce briefly the book, and then I pose some very difficult questions to the editors, because I am also a question paper setter. There is a very compact and short, very short, not ambitious introduction to the book. I would like to begin with the last paragraph of the book, which is very important. URA's writings are those of a modern Indian striving to come to terms, intellectual, aesthetic, and normative, with a complex entity called Indian civilization. The Essential UR Ananthamurthy is an attempt to convey a sense of this magisterial endeavor. And I would like to congratulate the editors for having selected very judiciously and thoughtfully the extracts from URA's works. So thank you, Manu sir, and thank you, Chandan, for giving us this slice of URA's writings. And briefly, just Chandan has given me 30 seconds. The novels extracted here, and the book begins with excerpts from novels. Obviously, first Samskara, and particularly, personally, I liked the episode you have selected. I will tell later why it is an important selection. And that's where editorial intervention and your selection, I liked it. Then we have Bharatipura and Avaste Bhava. Poetry are not, you are a poetry. Chandan, you have done a very good translation. And I'm a fan of his prose. And now, for the first time, I read your poetry. Excellent, but I have some reservations for the selection of poetry. You could have thought of some other, our favorite poems of URA. That's a different matter. Even if I had done the same work, you would have asked the same question. That's a different question. And short stories, obviously, Gata Shraddha, Mauni, Stalin of the Sun, Jaratkutu, Akkaya, and Kamarupi. Essays, already Manu sir has edited 2 volumes, one with Deepa Ganesh and yourself, and another independently one, I think. Yeah. So here there are about 9 essays, and it is Ananthamurthy at his best. To me, what is important in Ananthamurthy is his thought, and that is very well reflected here. Then from his memoir, Suragi, then very interesting, A Life in the World. Chandan has done, I have elsewhere described about it as a speaking biography. It's a very good interview which shows the life of the mind, which is not covered in Suragi and other writings. You have covered it, and that is also extracted. This is all about this book. But now I would like to ask questions to the editors. You need not take it like MCQs. What does it mean to read the Essential UR at a time when Prime Minister Narendra Modi's rhetoric and roadshow could not help the BJP in Karnataka's recent assembly election. I hope you know the context. The way URA, practiced what the Greeks call parousia, speaking truth to power. And the second question, the first question is a political question, and the second question is completely academic and personal. We two English professors are sitting here, and Professor URA was a professor of English. He chose to write in Kannada, although he went abroad, Birmingham University, and worked with, he did not become yet another cultural or literary critic like his own teacher C.D. Narasimhaya. He chose to be a creative writer, and he chose Kannada. And we are translating English teachers' Kannada writings into English. A very interesting this thing, how to understand, this cultural politics of language, literature, and translation. It is very, very interesting thing for me. And personally, to me, what URA is, I would like to capture URA with two frames. One, obviously, taking a cue from Martin Heidegger. I'm just quoting. I'm a professor. I have to profess my professorship. Therefore, I quote. Heidegger says, every writer need not think, and every thinker need not write. But to be a writer of the first rank, there is a thinking that the writer must accomplish. And what is important in URA is thought. It is his thinking. As a craftsman, I don't know, I am not an authority on the Kannada novel, but he is a novelist, no doubt, but it is thought that prevails over his craftsmanship. And that is very, very important for me. And then, if he is a thinker, 20th century thinker, what kind of a thinker he was? And I would like to capture this, again by quoting Dipesh Chakravarthy, what Dipesh Chakravarthy said about Ashish Nandi. In most third world countries, including India, the 20th century intellectual has to face inevitably one important problem. That problem is, what does one do with or about those practices of the past that seem undesirable but that apparently refuse to die? For example, caste discrimination, sati, etc. So, URA is a kind of intellectual who struggled to negotiate between these past practices, which we don't want in the modern India, but yet they continue to exist. Like Ashish Nandi, he struggled with this kind of problem, and his typical example of this can be found in his essay on nude worship. ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆಗೆ ಬರೆದ ಒಂದು ಎಸೆ ಇದೆ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ. So, and the same problem is articulated in his creative writings also. Therefore, URA is important for us, because those 20th century problems continue to exist and haunt us even in the 21st century. But the interesting thing is that by profession, he was an academic, but he articulated these problems through metaphors and stories. even in his essays, he is through and through a storyteller. He may not be a great storyteller like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but he is a politically committed storyteller. And so, how to introduce such a mind? Especially, I wanted the editors, with regard to the novels, I wanted them to preface each novel with a short note, you know. For example, D.R. Nagaraj has written a fantastic article on the birth of Bharatipura. How Bharatipura took shape in Hegodu, and URA saw one photograph in somebody's house, and that is the moment of the birth of this novel. So the point is, when we do this kind of work, it is not just meant for Professor Raghavendra Rao's sir's generation and my generation. We do it for the future generation as well. Then how to reconstruct? Behind every text, there is a story. So more than the content analysis, I think it would have been better had the editors placed, especially novels, if not poems and speeches, in a proper context. And we have, if Samskara tells one story, Samskara itself is a story, and the readers miss that story. Although, Chandan, you have given this thing, but I wanted you to be more ambitious. And also, I'm just curious to know, this is again, there is a story of this book, okay, how it originated. And I want to know, how did you fight with each other in selecting and all these things? I wanted to know that kind of little bit of masala, how, you know, selected, you agreed upon. This is very interesting to me. That is also part of, you know, our intellectual culture. I want you to respond to it. And I must tell, both are preeminently eligible, you know, to do this work. And as far as I know, Chandan has written fantastic pieces, and also he has translated URA. And Gurugala Gurugalu, he's a favorite student of Dr. URA, and he has worked on, both are URA scholars. They knew URA personally and thoroughly. So they deserve a round of applause for this work. But I think before I close my remark, this morning I came across a piece, a speech URA delivered after receiving Jnanpith Award. That is important for all writers and readers. Finally, why should we read URA in 21st century? I quote URA. There is something wrong with us writers if we do not lose a few of our admirers with every new book that we write. You also have written this book. Otherwise, it may mean we are imitating ourselves or trying to keep true to the image that we have built for ourselves in the public eye. Rhetoric is dangerous, including my rhetoric here, for it evokes a public emotion, the emotion of the crowd. People want to feel safe and comfortable listening to lies, yet their soul wants to listen to the truth. We should never lose the capacity to say those things in which we believe when we are absolutely alone. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Gundur. We'll respond after everyone is done with their responses. Our next speaker is Anjum Hasan. Anjum is a novelist, as most of you know. She's just published a novel, History's Angel, and also put together a reader of contemporary Indian writing called The Future Library. Anjum. And I should also mention, she wrote a long essay on UR Ananthamurthy's writings in the Caravan some years back.
Yeah. Thank you, Chandan. Can you hear me with this mic? Yeah, I think it's better now? Yes. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Chandan. Honored to be on this panel, absolutely. Very delighted to see this reader, especially because when I was writing that essay that you talked about, I went on this URA drive about 5 years ago, and I tried to find everything I could in translation. I can't read him in the original, but I felt that he must be written about by a reader who's accessing him from the outside, as it were. And so, like I said, I went on this drive and tried to find everything I could, but I don't think it was that easy. Things were scattered, things were out of print. There was, of course, we know there have been some excellent translations, legendary translations in the case of the novels, the early novels, but also a lot that is not translated still, I think especially the short fiction and the essays. So it was a partial, by necessity, it was a partial reading, but it was a fascinating one. And I really tried to find a path through all his work in that essay. It's on the Caravan website if you're interested. And so I was really delighted to see this book because I discovered some things that I had already read and some things that I was discovering for the first time. Of course, there's so much more. This is just a very small part, I think, still of his oeuvre. And it says so much, I think, about what you refer to as these 20th century stalwarts, that in some ways they are still local. And I don't know if translating into English is necessarily the way to make them more accessible, but I do think they need to be more accessible, especially someone like URA, who I think was in many ways a pan-Indian figure as well. He was thinking about Indian problems in and through Karnataka and being a Kannada writer. So I really think it's important that he's read outside Karnataka as well. What attracts me to URA is the way he can personalize all ideas. I mean, his style is something that is very, it's very, very playful, metaphorical, immediate, direct. And so I'm going to respond to the book in a personal way. And he was a student and a teacher of English literature. I don't know what he thought of E.M. Forster. He's written a great deal about the writers that he was close to, but Forster has this dictum that I often remember, which is that the final test of a novel will be our affection for it. And I think URA's relationship to the writers he admired was often one, he quarreled intellectually, but also there's a wonderful sense of affection for D.H. Lawrence, for Lohia, Ram Manohar Lohia, for his contemporaries in the Kannada world. And I think we should remember that it's always a very living thing, his criticism. What he says about Lawrence is that, and Lohia, he has a wonderful essay. I think that's just a model essay for a writer exploring his sources, where he talks about his admiration for Lawrence and Lohia, which figures who on the face of it have nothing in common, but they come together in URA's imagination. So I'm going to talk about why do I relate to URA, or how do I relate to URA as somebody who is living in Karnataka, didn't know him personally, heard him speak as a public figure, and then read him, like I said, in translation. I think if you write in English, you are always at sea. You know, you are constantly trying to find your bearings. Where do you belong in the world of broadly speaking literature in English. Of course, in India, the genre is substantial enough now, but you're still never sure of where are your antecedents, who are your forefathers or foremothers really. How do you navigate this field? Because it is enormous, right? It's global territory. And I think why I related to URA at once is that he helps me find my bearings as a writer. I don't think it matters that I'm writing in English and he wrote mostly in Kannada. I think the questions he asks about is like the Borges thing. You create the past, right, through developing these affinities with the writers who went before you. And I think URA is doing that with Lawrence and Lohia and Gandhi. And Edmund Burke, who he, the English liberal Edmund Burke, who he was made to learn as a child by heart. So,
his denunciation of Hastings.
Exactly, the Warren Hastings impeachment, the famous Warren Hastings impeachment, and Burke's critique of that was something that URA imbibed as a child. So he's recreating his predecessors for us. He's sort of reinventing them anew as figures in URA's world. And so similarly for me, I think URA is somebody who helps me reread certain things, look at certain things differently because of his slant on them. Now there's one way to look at literature, which is that everything and anything is our is our right to access. You know, there are no boundaries. Literature is not held in by national boundaries. So I could be reading Indian writers, American writers, British writers, whatever. You know, there are no limits. I can choose who I want to read to create my own sense of my place in writing. And that is like the Salman Rushdie view. He has this phrase called the frontierless landscape of literature. And for Rushdie, Jane Austen and R.K. Narayan and Marquez and Faulkner are contemporaries. You know, they live next door to each other. And it's a wonderful, exhilarating, classic liberal view that there are no boundaries and there are no limits. But for me, somebody like Ananthamurthy is more interesting because he's saying, yes, I relate to Lawrence. Yes, I relate to the Russian masters. Yes, I even relate to Galsworthy and Shaw and all the older English writers who were being read. Yes, I grew up in an era when the European existentialists were very popular and we drew a lot from them. But there is something in my own literature, in my own culture, in the writers who are closer to me, who write in my language, that sort of complicate that relationship to the West. And he's always asking this question about how do you read and how do you write as an Indian writer. So it's what I find interesting about him, even though he, in his public pronouncements, could sometimes seem that he is only upholding the value of the local, of the vernacular, of the Kannada, it was never as straightforward. I think he was constantly asking, how do we relate to the West through an Indian or a Kannada or a local perspective? And to me, that is a way of making maps rather than the dismissal of maps that someone like Rushdie does. And I think that's something that we can all still learn from. I certainly still find myself trying to learn from that. How do you create certain affinities that are not like everything goes? And the danger with the everything goes, maybe even the danger with being a rooted, he didn't like the word cosmopolitan, and he said he's not a cosmopolitan, but I think in some senses he was. The danger with that always is that you end up being eclectic, right? You take in things from everywhere. And the word that he used very often in his writing is dialectic, right? Eclecticism is easier. It's harder to, it's easier to pursue, but I think it's harder to defend. Whereas the dialectic is always a conversation. And I think Ananthamurthy's thinking is really always a conversation. Sometimes it's a quarrel, but it's often a conversation. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about, and the third thing will just be a question, so I'll be brief with the third one. The second thing is language, of course. I mean, like I said, he is always returning to his roots. He's always returning to the Bhakti poets. He's returning to the older Kannada writers that he read, the Masti and the Kuvempu. He's returning to his contemporaries. And Chandan has a wonderful conversation with him that's printed in this book, reprinted in this book, where he asks him, do you still have any prejudices? And this is towards the end of his life and is really very, very moving conversation because he's really taking stock of a lot of things. And he asks him, are there still any prejudices you retain? And he says, I don't like people who only talk in English and who live in India and still can pull off this sort of monolingual English attitude, you know? So he's very clear about that, and he's rightly suspicious of even that sort of existence where you can be cut off from, you can live here and you can still be cut off from languages other than English. And he says you're either stupid or you're dull, ignorant, or pretentious. I mean, synonyms for those adjectives. So this is a very strong thing, of course, in him, and he is very, I think one of the few times that I heard him speak, he was very, very clear about his criticism about people who hold on to English as a value. And in my essay, the one I referred to, there is a quote that I bring in from the writer Jnanpith, who did in fact only write in English. He was a wonderful poet and non-fiction writer, but he also translated from the Malayalam. And he says that he heard Ananthamurthy speak at the Sahitya Academy, saying that those who write in English are doing it to make money, and they're writing it in the language of the World Bank and global consumerism. So there will be more around it. Yeah, so there is no doubt. So he had that position, and there's a curious sort of footnote to that, which is that I encountered the same view in one of Girish Karnad's plays, Heap of Broken Images. The character says, so there's this lovely sort of little tussle going on about the use of English. But the thing is with Ananthamurthy that you can't pin him down to anything, because then I'm reading these essays and he is talking about a Kannada writer who he doesn't actually name, but he says the mother tongue of the writer was Marathi, and there's a scene where, so he talks at home in Marathi, he writes in perfect Kannada, and he doesn't know that when he's moving between these languages, he would not regard it as a translation, but that's what he's doing. When he's writing characters who are Marathi speaking in Kannada, he's doing a translation in his head, and there's this scene where URA is sitting with this writer and his daughter. Bendre. Oh, Bendre, yes. His daughter comes in and says something to him in Marathi, and then they're having a conversation in Kannada. And of course, this wonderful way in which many of us live in a multilingual reality, and we don't make a monument out of it. We don't ascribe multilingualism to it. It's just the air and the water, just the environment in which we live. And when he's describing the scene with Bendre, the next line is, he says, and of course, this sort of organic translation, he doesn't use the word organic, but that's what he means, is also something our best English writers do, right? So in that one sentence, I think he is acknowledging that there are writers like R.K. Narayan, there are writers, other writers, maybe even Ramanujan to some extent, who are living in that. So they're not outside the pale completely. So I just use this example to show that even as categorical as an opinion as he had on English, the use of English is qualified when he's actually in conversation with people who may be using the language. So just, again, this dialectic rather than, the categorical position. The third point is really a question, I think, to you and Professor Manu about URA's word. It's not to do with your choice of texts in the book. It's just a larger question, I think, about the world that he describes in his stories, especially, also in his novels. But the stories are a little more reflective. They're almost like bordering sometimes on the polemical. I think there's even a point in the wonderful famous Stallion for the Sun where he suddenly stops and says, this is turning into an essay. He's having this back and forth with Venkata, and he says, oh wait, I wanted to have this as I'm writing about this character, but this is becoming, too discursive, it's turning. So his stories are very self-reflexive, even Akaya. So I think Akaya and Stallion for the Sun are companion pieces to my mind, because they're both about, what would you call characters like this? I mean, I don't think pre-modern is the right word, but sort of folk characters out of some kind of unacknowledged Indian past or Indian reality. That's the very modern cosmopolitan narrator is tussling with or has a relationship with. That is Stallion for the Sun and Akaya. But what I wanted to ask, because you see this also in URA's later fiction, this sense that all the old environments are being destroyed by development, and there are characters who go back home to find that home no longer exists in the same form. So my question simply is, does that world in which an Akaya and a Venkata and the other characters in some of his novels, does that world still exist? Can one still read these stories as a record of something, as a touchstone of something that still exists? That was just a doubt that I wanted to end with. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't overstepped the limit.
Not at all. But the world does exist. The world exists. Thank you, Anjum. Our next speaker is Professor H.S. Raghavendra Rao, a very distinguished Kannada writer, teacher, critic. He's published extensively. I can't even begin to start naming them. Yes, I'm really honored that he's on this panel. Thank you.
ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. I started in Kannada, but I assure you that this talk would be bilingual. I may shuttle a bit the two languages that I am reasonably familiar with, but obviously, being a Kannada teacher for almost 45 years, I am more conversant with my language. And just as Ananthamurthy was, he was a great orator in Kannada. I have not heard him speak in English very frequently. Because all of us, at least people belonging to my generation, have lived with his writings, lived with his talks, lived his opinions, and lived with the sudden shifts in his attitude, ideology. I would rather call it evolution rather than shifts or U-turns. Anyway, I want to focus on this particular anthology than Ananthamurthy's writings per se or his ideas per se, even though it's very tempting for us to do that. Because we have written about Ananthamurthy and spoken about him quite a few times, but this particular symposium, I think, should focus on the nature of anthology, questions raised by this particular anthology, and solutions found by the eminent editors whom I congratulate for a wonderful effort. Well, whenever you speak of an anthology from a native language to English, we should consider three facets. One, politics of translation. Two, politics of editing. And thirdly, critical analysis of the content and different modes of translation involved in the translations. Because translating a story into English is altogether different from translating a discursive article. And translating a poem is another cup of tea. So, secondly, when you are presenting a native Kannada writer to a pan-Indian audience, there are certain requirements which have to be met, both by the translators and the editors. I want to focus on that to some extent in this particular context. This anthology will be hopefully read by those who are not conversant with Kannada. People who know Kannada would rather prefer to read them in original language than this translation. This happens to be, unless you're critically oriented and trying to compare between the two and make judgmental remarks, etc., etc. That is the exception rather than the rule. Thirdly, why do works in a given language and get translated into English? What is the reason behind that? And how does one gets translated very extensively and other important writers do not get that opportunity? This is a very crucial question as far as a person like me, who is reasonably entrenched in my own language, is concerned. Probably, Ananthamurthy, I would rather call him Ananthamurthy than URA. I'm more used to that. Anyway, Ananthamurthy is probably the most translated author in Kannada. Not Kuvempu, not Karan, not Masti, not Yashwant Chital, probably not any other writer. And probably Bhairappa's novels are translated into many other languages, including Sanskrit, but reasons are altogether different. That again is a point factor in politics of translation. Well, the reason for this, I'm always thinking about the reasons for things getting translated into another language. Why is it translated to English rather than other Indian languages? Why don't they get translated into Telugu, Tamil, Kashmiri, Punjabi, whom it should be meant essentially? Why is this temptation to get translated into English compared to any other language? What are the motivations behind that? What is the modus operandi of getting these things translated? And what is the motivation of the translators, original writer, and the publishing industry? Why does a particular publishing industry publishes a particular kind of books, particular kind of translated books? These are very complex issues. Most of you are already aware of that. But I am focusing on Ananthamurthy's translations in this particular occasion. Actually, Ananthamurthy had a galaxy of very competent students because he himself was a great teacher and orator. And his magnetic personality and, more importantly, the interest evinced by him in problems faced by India at large in different fields because he did not just write literary criticism. He just did not write, focus on particular writers and made a scholastic examination of that particular writer's writings at large. But he was always moving with the times and presenting his views, both socio-political as applied, as seen by a cultural person related to culture, closely immersed in his culture, at the same time always being open to other possibilities. Because his views were always pluralistic rather than monochromatic. This doesn't usually happen. One or two writers make efforts to get translated. Many others do not get that kind of atmosphere to get themselves translated. Anyway, let me move on. And his writings extensively on social, political and philosophical problems from the vantage point of view of a creative artist. This is another important thing. There are scholars and scholars who research on a particular topic, read a lot and indulge in an intellectual dialogue with similar scholars. But Ananthamurthy, by and large, basically, he was a creative writer rather than a scholar in any particular discipline or in a particular area of literature also. He was a very competent teacher. He could communicate really well. But for instance, I would like to compare with him, let's say, Professor Amur or D.R. Nagaraj, etc. If you compare the writings of these three writers, you will find some are scholastic, some are socio-cultural, some are written by a creative writer who could write fiction, etc., and also talk about these things in this vernacular. Actually, I don't think not even 10% of the essays in this particular anthology are written by Ananthamurthy himself in English. They are translated here now. But he wrote about these problems in his own language. But in spite of that, people from other languages and other states could find it relevant to their own problems. This pan-Indian nature of his search probably resulted in a huge number of translations from him. Let's move on again. And also he was not a theorist in any sense of the word. He did not develop theories and present them as a solid work of scholarship. He was more inclusive about various areas and thereby merging them into a single writing. ಇದು ಬಹಳ ಕಷ್ಟದ ಕೆಲಸ ಮತ್ತು ಬಹಳ ಅಪರೂಪದ ಕೆಲಸ. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ನೀವು ಸೋಷಿಯಾಲಜಿನಲ್ಲೋ ಇಕನಾಮಿಕ್ಸಲ್ಲೋ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಲ್ಲೋ ತುಂಬ ಓದ್ಕೊಂಡು ಅದ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಥೀಸಿಸ್ ಬರೀಬೋದು. ಅದು ಜನರಾಗಿ ಮುಟ್ಟೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬದಲಾಗಿ ಅದೇನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಪಂಡಿತರ ನಡುವಿನ ಚರ್ಚೆಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಮೀಸಲಾಗ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಪೋಸ್ಟ್ ಗ್ರ್ಯಾಜುಯೇಟ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಪಾಠ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದರೆ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅಂಥವರು ಮಾತಾಡಿದಾಗ ಅದು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಒಳಗೊಳ್ಳೋ ಹಾಗಿರ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಇನ್ಕ್ಲೂಸಿವ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಆಡಿಯನ್ಸ್. ಹೇಗೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಅವರು ಹೆಚ್ಚಾಗಿ ಅನುಭವದ ನೆಲೆಯಿಂದ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಹೊರತು, ಅನುಭವವನ್ನು ಬೆಲೆ ಕಟ್ಟೋ ನೆಲೆಯಿಂದ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಹೊರತು, ಪಾಂಡಿತ್ಯವನ್ನು ಅವಲಂಬಿಸಿ ಮಾತಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲಿ ಬರೆಯೋದಕ್ಕಾಗಲಿ ಅವರು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದು ಬಹಳ ಕಡಿಮೆ ನೆನಪೋರೋ ಹಾಗೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಇವರು ಅನುವಾದವಾಗೋದ್ರ ಹಿಂದೆ ಈ ರೀತಿ ಹಲವು ಕಾರಣಗಳಿವೆ. ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾನು ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಬೆಳೆಸೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತು ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಗೆ ಬರೋದಾದರೆ, ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಹೆಸರೇನೆ ದ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅಂತ ಇದೆ. ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು, ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಯಾರಿಗೆ? ಇದು ನಾನು ಪಾಲಿಟಿಕ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಎಡಿಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಲ್ಲ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟು ಯಾರಿಗಿದೆ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ಲು? ಇದನ್ನು ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಅಂತ ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಯಾರು? ಅದರ ಹಿಂದಿರುವಂಥ ಕಾರಣಗಳೇನು? ಇವು ಕೂಡ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳಲ್ವಾ. ನಾನು ಚಂದನ್ ಗೌಡ ಅವರು ಮತ್ತು ಮನು ಚಕ್ರವರ್ತಿ ಅವರು ಎಡಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಅನ್ಕೋತಾರೆ, ಅದು ನನಗೂ ಹಾಗೆ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತಾ, ಇನ್ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ಬರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಹಾಗೆ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತಾ? ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಅನಿಸಲ್ಲ? ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡುತ್ತಿರುವವರ ಐಡಿಯಾಲಜಿ, ಸಂಪಾದನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವರ ಈ ಕಾಲದ ಆದ್ಯತೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ಅವರು ಸುತ್ತಲಿನ ರಾಜಕೀಯದ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಜೀವನದ ಪಲ್ಸ್ನ ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡು ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದು ಮುಖ್ಯ ಅಂತ ಅವರು ತೀರ್ಮಾನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಅವರ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಯ ಯುನೀಕ್ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ ಏನು, ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದ ಮೂವಿಂಗ್ ಸ್ಪಿರಿಟ್ ಬಿಹೈಂಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇದೆ. ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ 50 ಕತೆ ಬರೆದ್ರೆ ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಲೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದರ ಹಿಂದೆ ಇರುವ ಇಟಿಯಾಲಜಿ ಯಾವುದು, ಅದರ ಹಿಂದೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಸಾಮಾಜಿಕವಾದ ಪ್ರೇರಣೆಗಳು ಯಾವುದು, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಕೂಡ ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾದ ಸಂಗತಿಗಳು. ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗೆ ಇಡೀ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಗೆ ಬರೆದಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಇಂಟ್ರಡಕ್ಷನಿನ ಮೊದಲ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸಿನೇ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿನೂ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಉಡುಪಿ ರಾಜಗೋಪಾಲಾಚಾರ್ಯ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ವಾಸ್ ಬಾರ್ನ್ ಇನ್ ಎ ಮಾಧ್ವ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಿನ್ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಅಂತ ಶುರುವಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅಂದರೆ ಒಬ್ಬ ಲೇಖಕನ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಭಾಷೆಯ ಓದುಗರಿಗೆ ಕೊಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಅವನ ಊರು, ಅವನ ತಂದೆ, ಅವನ ಜಾತಿ, ಆ ಜಾತಿ ಒಳಗೆ ಉಪಜಾತಿಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಯಾಕೆ ಅನಿಸುತ್ತೆ? ಇದು ನನಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಖುಷಿ. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಯಾವ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸು ಕೂಡ ಸಂಪಾದಕರಾಗಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಯಾರೇ ಆಗಲಿ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ತಮಾಷೆಗೆ ಬರೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಬರೆಯೋ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಕಾರಣ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆ ಕಾರಣ ಏನು? ಈ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ನಾನು ಕೇಳಿಕೊಂಡೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಆರಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಆರಿಸಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಹಳ ಒಂದು ವಿಚಿತ್ರವಾದ ಸಂಗತಿ ಇದೆ. ವಿಚಿತ್ರವಾದ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನವ್ಯವನ್ನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡ, ನವ್ಯವನ್ನು ಪ್ರತಿಪಾದಿಸಿದ, ನವ್ಯದ ಪರವಾಗಿ ವಕೀಲಿಗಾಳಿದಂಥ ದಿನಗಳು ಒಂದಷ್ಟು ಇತ್ತು. ತುಂಬ ಬರೆದ್ರಂತ ಅಂಥವ್ರು. ಪದ್ಯ ಬರೆದ್ರು, ಕತೆ ಬರೆದ್ರು, ಕಾದಂಬರಿಗಳಲ್ಲೂ ಆ ನಿಲುವಿತ್ತು. ಈ ಮಾಡರ್ನಿಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಇದರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಆಲೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಏನು ಬರೆದ್ರು, ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಕಥೆಗಳು ಬರೆದ್ರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹಂತದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡರ್ನಿಸಮ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾನೂ ಕೂಡ ಇದನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಪ್ಲೂರಲಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ಒಂದು ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದನ್ನು ಹುಡುಕೋದು ಹೇಗೆ, ಅದನ್ನು ಯಾಕೆ ಹುಡುಕಬೇಕು, ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಏನು ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರು. ಇದೊಂಥರ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಎ ವೆರಿ ಫೈನ್ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸಿಂಗ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್. ಈ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸಿಂಗ್ ಕೆಲಸ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಅವ್ರ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟಿವ್ ರೈಟಿಂಗಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತೋ ಹಾಗೇ ನಾನ್ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟಿವ್ ವರ್ಕಲ್ಲೂ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ವ್ಯತ್ಯಾಸ ಯಾಕೆ ಬಂತು, ಏನು ಬಂತು ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನು ಕೇಳಿಕೊಂಡೆ. ಹಾಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗ ನನ್ನ ಗಮನಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು, ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಕತೆ, ಕಾದಂಬರಿ ಮತ್ತು ಪದ್ಯ ಇಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಆರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗ ಕತೆ, ಕಾದಂಬರಿ ಎರಡಕ್ಕೂ ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಬರೆದ ಕತೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಸಿಕ್ತು, ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಬರೆದ ಕಾದಂಬರಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಸಿಕ್ತು, ಯಾಕೆ ಸಿಗಲಿಲ್ಲ? ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗೆ ಕಾದಂಬರಿಗಳಿಂದ ಆಯ್ದ ಭಾಗಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧವಾದ ಸಂಸ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ 21 ಪುಟ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಮಿಕ್ಕ 4 ಕಾದಂಬರಿಗಳಿಗೆ 22 ಪುಟ ಇದೆ. ಹಾಗೆಯೇ ಇದು ಇನ್ನೂ ಇಂಟ್ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಅದು ನನಗೆ, ಆ ಲೇಖನಗಳಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಕ್ರಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಆರ್ಟಿಕಲ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ಕಲ್ಚರಲ್, ಇದು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಇತ್ತೀಚಿನ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಗೆ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡುತ್ತೆ, ಹಿಂದಿನ ಬರವಣಿಗೆ ಅಷ್ಟು ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆ ಹಾಗಾಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ಅವರ ರುಜುವಾತು ಸಂಪಾದಕೀಯಗಳನ್ನು ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಣ. ಮೌನ ಕಣಿವೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ವೆರಿ ವೆರಿ ಸೆಲೆಬ್ರೇಟೆಡ್ ಎಸ್ಸೆ ಇನ್ ಕನ್ನಡ. ಅದು ಮೌನ ಕಣಿವೆಯ ರುಜುವಾತು ಒಂದು ಸಂಪಾದಕೀಯ ಲೇಖನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು. ಅಥವಾ ಆಕಾಶ ಬೇಕು ಕತೆ ಇದೆ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಮಳೆ ಹುಯ್ಯುತ್ತಿದೆ, ಎಲ್ಲ ನೆನಪಾಗುತ್ತಿದೆ ಎನ್ನುವ ಒಂದು ಪದ್ಯ ಇದೆ. ಇಲ್ಲೇನಾಗಿದೆ, ಯಾಕಾಗಿದೆ ಅನ್ನೋ ವಿಷಯ ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡೋಣ, ನಾವು ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯ ಕೊನೆಯ ದಿನಗಳಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಒಂದು 10 ವರ್ಷ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು, ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯ ಚಿಂತನೆಯ ಸ್ವರೂಪ, ನಾವು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಇಂಟೆಲೆಕ್ಚುಯಲ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಇಂಟೆಲೆಕ್ಚುಯಲ್ ಯಾವಾಗ ಬೈನರಿ ಡಿಬೇಟ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇಂಡಲ್ಜ್ ಆಗ್ತಾನೆ, ಯಾವಾಗ ಅವನು ಒಂದು ಇಂಟರ್ನಲ್ ಸರ್ಚ್ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ತನ್ನ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಡೈಲಾಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರಿತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ, ಒಬ್ಬ ಕನ್ಫ್ರಾಂಟೇಷನ್ ಬೇರೆ, ಅದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಕನ್ಫ್ರಾಂಟೇಷನ್ಗಿಂತ ಭಿನ್ನವಾದಂತಹ ನನ್ನೊಳಗನ್ನು ನಾನೇ ನೋಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಕಂಡುಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಬಗೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದಿರುತ್ತೆ. ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಜನ್ರೇಷನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯ ಮೊದಲ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ತುಂಬ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಯಾವುದು? ಒಳಗನ್ನು ನೋಡುವುದು, ಹೊರಗನ್ನು ನೋಡುವುದು, ಹೊರಗಿನ ಜೊತೆ ಜಗಳ ಇದ್ದೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದರೆ ಒಳಗನ್ನು ನೋಡಿದಾಗಲೇ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ನಾವು ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗೋಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಹೀಗಿದ್ದಿದ್ದು ಹಾಗಾಯಿತು. ಯಾಕಾಯಿತು? ಜಗತ್ತನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ನಾವೇ ನೋಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಆಗ್ಬೋದಲ್ಲ. ಎರಡನೇದು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅವರ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯ ಮೊದಲ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟವಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಆದರೆ ಕೊನೆಯ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡ ಸ್ಟಾನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಏನೋ ಕೆಟ್ಟದ್ದಾಗ್ತಿದೆ, ಆಗ್ಬಾರದ್ದಾಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಇದನ್ನು ವಿರೋಧಿಸುವುದು ನನ್ನ ಕರ್ತವ್ಯ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಅವರು. ಇದು ತಪ್ಪು ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲೂ ಅನೇಕರಿಗೆ ಹಾಗೆ ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಏನು ಫಂಡಮೆಂಟಲಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಪಾಲಿಟಿಕ್ಸ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಫಂಡಮೆಂಟಲಿಸಮ್ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವಿರೋಧ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದರೆ ಈ ವಿರೋಧ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಇಂಟೆಲೆಕ್ಚುಯಲ್ ಒಬ್ಬ ಇದು ಹೇಗೆ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡಲ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಆತನಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿ ಇನ್ಕ್ಲೂಸಿವ್ನೆಸ್ ಇರಬೇಕಾ? ನಾವು ಯಾರನ್ನ ಎದುರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಅವರನ್ನು ನಮ್ಮೊಳಗೆ ತಂದುಕೊಳ್ಳುವ ಗುಣ ಇರಬೇಕಾ? ನೀನಿದೆಯಾ, ನಿನಗೆ ನಾ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ, ನೀನು ಕೇಳು ಬಿಡು ಕೇಳು, ನಾ ಹೇಳೋದು ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂದಾಗಬೇಕಾ? ಈ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ಅವರ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯ ಕೊನೆಯ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇಳಿಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತ ಕಾಣುತ್ತೆ. ಹಾಗಾದಾಗ ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಏನಾಗಿದೆ, ಇಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷಲ್ಲಿ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಇವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ, ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ನನಗೆ ಐ ಬಿಕಮ್ rather facile when I speak in my language. I hope you will pardon me. Anyway, ಈ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸ ಇದೆ. even though I written my notes in English, I am switching to Kannada basically. Anyway, ಏನಾಗುತ್ತವಾಗ ಅಂದರೆ ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಲೇಖನಗಳನ್ನು ಸೆಲೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದಾಗ ಯಾಕೆ ಅವರ ಇತ್ತೀಚಿನ ಬರವಣಿಗೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ? ಕಥೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸೆಲೆಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಇತ್ತೀಚಿನ ಬರವಣಿಗೆ? ಅದು 6 ಕಥೆ ಇದೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಮೌನಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಘಟಶ್ರಾದ್ದ ಬಿಲಾಂಗ್ ಟು ಹಿಸ್ ಅರ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಫೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ರೈಟಿಂಗ್. ಆಲ್ ಅದರ್ಸ್, ಜರತ್ಕಾರು, ಅಕ್ಕಯ್ಯ, ಸ್ಟಾಲಿನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಸನ್ falls somewhere in between. Almost 4 stories out of 6 belong to the later period. Most of us in Kannada literature and intellectual field, we have some differences with his later creative writing rather than his earlier creative writing. Avastha, Samskara, the whole Kannada world celebrated those novels. But ಭವ ದಿವ್ಯ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿಗಳು ಬಂದಾಗ ಅದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಲಿ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಸಮ್ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸಸ್. ವೈ? ಆ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟಿವ್ ರೈಟಿಂಗಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತೋ, ಕ್ರಿಟಿಕಲ್ ರೈಟಿಂಗಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಥರ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ, ಡಿಸ್ಕರ್ಸಿವ್ ಪ್ರೋಸಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಥರ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ. ಈ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳಿದಾಗ ಆದರೂ ಯಾಕೆ ಹಂಗಾಯಿತು? ನೀನೊಬ್ಬ ಕಥೆಗಾರನಾಗಿ ಬರೆಯೋಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದಾಗ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಆಗೋ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಗಳಿಗೂ ಅದನ್ನ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡಲ್ ಮಾಡೋ ರೀತಿಗೂ, ಒಬ್ಬ ಚಿಂತಕನಾಗಿ ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದಾಗ ಅದರಲ್ಲೂ ಬೈಪೋಲಾರ್ ಆದಾಗ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಈ ರಿಲೇಷನ್ಶಿಪ್ ಏನು ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾನು ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಯೋಚನೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ರೆಸಿಡೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಕನ್ನಡ ಲಿಟ್ರೇಚರ್, ವಿ ಕಂಪೇರ್ ವಿತ್ ಹಿಮ್ ಅದರ್ ರೈಟರ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಕನ್ನಡ. ಅವ್ರ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲೇ ಲಂಕೇಶ್ ಬರೀತಾಯಿದ್ರು, ತೇಜಸ್ವಿ ಬರೀತಾಯಿದ್ರು, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಶಿವಪ್ರಕಾಶ್ ಬರೆದ್ರು, ಬೇರೆಯವರು ಬೇರೆ ಥರ ಬರೀತಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ. ಇವುಗಳ ಜೊತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ರೈಟಿಂಗ್ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಸಂಬಂಧ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೆ, ಯಾಕೆ ಹಾಗೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೆ, ಅವೆಲ್ಲದರ ರಿಸಲ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಬರುತ್ತಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ವಿಷಯ ಬರವಣಿಗೆ, ಆ ಬರವಣಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡೋದು ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಕಾಡ್ತಾನೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಅದನ್ನು ಹೇಗೆ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡಲ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಫೋಕಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಸಲ. ಇಫ್ ಐ ಲುಕ್ ಅಟ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್, ಕಾಂಟೆಂಪರರಿ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ಗೆ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಒತ್ತು ಕೊಟ್ಟಂತಹ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣುತ್ತೆ. ಕಾಂಟೆಂಪರರಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಪ್ರಾಬಲಿ 21st century, ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಡೆಕೇಡ್ ಇನ್ ಇಸ್ ಲೈಫ್. ಆಗ ಅವರು ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಹೆಚ್ಚೆಚ್ಚು ಪ್ರೊಪಗೇಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಯಾವುದರ ಪರವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಅದರ ಮೇಲೆ ಒತ್ತು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. Even in the poems that are selected here, most of the poems belong to this later phase. His observations, Ugandhi ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಯಾವುದೊಂದು anecdote ಇದೆ. He selects that anecdote and narrates it simple, communicative prose. But how could that become poetry? ಈ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡಾಗ you are confronted with a problem. ನಮಗೆ ಏನು ಅನಿಸುತ್ತೆ, ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅವರು ಮೊದಲು ಸಂಕಲನ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಬಾವಲಿ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ನಂತರದನೇ ಬಂತಲ್ಲ, ಅಲ್ಲಿರುವ ಪೊಯಿಟ್ರಿ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ನಿಯರರ್ ಟು ಪೊಯಿಟಿಕ್ ಸೆನ್ಸಿಬಿಲಿಟಿ ಅಂತ. I have mentioned somewhere else that Ananthamurthy writes prose like poetry and poetry like prose. This has happened in many of his writings. Samskara is full of lyrical passages, poetic passages, but when he comes to poetry, he becomes more cerebral and intellectual. He presents ideas as poetry. How do you bring this particular issue in an anthology selected? An anthology can be representative or subjective. I do agree that all anthologies are subjective only, they cannot be different. But if an anthology is subjective and also representational, there is a tussle between the two. Representative ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೂ ಅದು ಕೇವಲ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ವ್ಯತ್ಯಾಸ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ನೇಚರ್ ಆಫ್ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್? ಆ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಯಾಕಾಗಾಯಿತು ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೂಡ ಕೇಳ್ತೀವಿ. ವೈ ಡಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಬಿಕಮ್ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ ಇನ್ ದಿಸ್ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ವೇ, ವೈ ನಾಟ್ ಇನ್ ಸಮ್ ಅದರ್ ವೇ? ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನನ್ನ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಉತ್ತರಗಳು ನಾನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಟ್ರೈ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಈ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಅದು ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದೇನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿ ಯಾರು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ? ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತಾ, ಅಡ್ಮೈರರ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದಟ್ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ರೈಟರ್ ಮಾಡುತ್ತಾ? ಯಾಕೆ ಅವಾಗ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? If there is not even a single critical remark about Ananthamurthy's writings in the whole anthology text, as well as the context, as well as the editorial remarks, what does it communicate? It is actually Professor Gundur has a particular point. If each of these pieces were complemented by a short editorial note saying why it was selected and what is the focus of that particular story or whatever. I know that paraphrasing creative literature is a foolish task. I did not expect them to paraphrase it, give their editorial comments about the particular piece. ಹಾಗೆ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗಿದ್ದರೆ this anthology could have been much more objective and also representational. ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನಲ್ ಆಗೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ನೆಸೆಸಿಟಿ ಇದೆ. ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಒಂಥರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಇಂಡಿವಿಜುವಲ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಒಂಥರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಅಡ್ಮೈರರ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಅನ್ ಆಂಥಾಲಜಿಸ್ಟ್ ಶುಡ್ ಬಿ ಕೇಪಬಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಬಿಕಮಿಂಗ್ ಕ್ರಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ದಿ ರೈಟಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ರೈಟರ್ ಹೂಮ್ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಎಡಿಟಿಂಗ್, ಅಟ್ ದಿ ಸೇಮ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಬೀಂಗ್ ಅಪ್ರಿಷಿಯೇಟಿವ್ ಆಫ್ ದೆಮ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ವೇರಿಯಸ್ ರೀಸನ್ಸ್. ಈ ಒಂದು ಫೈನ್ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸಿಂಗ್, ದಿಸ್ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ದ ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಿವ್ನೆಸ್ and appreciation, more that is present, the more valuable an anthology would become. That is at least my point of view. Of course, it's possible to find flaws and problems in the anthology made by me, edited by me also. That's not the point. Yeah, but so I think the introductory essay could have been, as Professor Gundur pointed out correctly, it could have been much more ambitious. It could have traced the evolution of Ananthamurthy as a creative writer, as a poet, as a novelist, as a short story writer, and also as an intellectual, and the various phases he went through as a public intellectual. Actually, we are very unsure about the very definition of the word public intellectual. That's at least my feeling nowadays. An public intellectual is not necessarily the proponent of a particular ideology. He is not an advocate. He should never be an advocate. It should be possible to rise above the contemporary pressures, exerted political realities, whatever. Should be able to look at these things objectively, at the same time not flinching to present his opinions. This fine balance between the confidence in your own points of view, but also the ability to receive other opinions. I think it's a very... So if you do that, you could trace the evolution of Ananthamurthy in many phases of his literary career and career as a thinker. That should be reflected both in the selections that are made and also in the remarks given, critical remarks given by him. It's possible to discern the reasons by just reading the anthology and the points selected. But if an editor makes his own point of view clear, it would be easier for us to either both assess it and come to our own conclusions. I think I almost taken all the time that was given to me. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity, and I beg the pardon of the audience for my slightly broken English. Thank you. Thank
you. Giving him one response right away, our suggested title was The Fragrant Suragi, not The Essential Ananthamurthy. This is the publisher's preference. Yeah. I mean, they wouldn't listen at all. What did you say with the suggested title was? The Fragrant Suragi. Suragi is the name of his autobiography. It's also a flower that doesn't lose its fragrance. So there were these compulsions. But
I understand.
Yes, thank you.
Such compulsions are always there. That's right. And also, I just wanted to add a couple of sentences about the translation per se, translators per se. This is the translations are not commissioned by the editors. Some translations are made by the editors themselves, but these translations are made over a period of almost 40 years. There's a translation made by A.K. Ramanujan, Ramchandra Sharma. These people belong to different generations, including H.Y. Sharda Prasad. They belong to different generations and they have adopted different modes of translation. And at some points, the editors have modified the translation to some extent here and there. They admitted that in the editorial itself. And obviously because of this reason, and also the constraint on the editors to publish whatever is available rather than get things done, this has created quite a few problems, I would say, because modern sensibility, particularly in this modern age, they keep on changing from generation to generation, even decade to decade. So same story, same poem can be translated in 10 different ways at different times and by different authors. If this is possible, that variety exists only in the time frame selected, rather than the individual translation. Because almost all the essays read similarly. Almost all the translations of stories, there are minimum stylistic differences. And one should read the stories and poems and the excerpt from the novels more extensively and more intensely to make proper evaluative remarks. I think it's not the place to do that, not even this book should be read for a few years and then only we can arrive at such decisions. But anyway, I just wanted to add this point to my presentation. Thank you.
Just again, a factual note. Except for one essay, every other essay in the non-fiction selection was originally done in English by him. And this was a judgment we both made based on the concerns in the essay. So an earlier essay in Kannada, may have been good to include just to note how he was writing early on, but the concerns were captured in a later essay. So these were very, and we actually felt, the early URA, including the book that was published recently, his first unfinished novel was published, the essential concern doesn't really change. It's extraordinary, the hankering for an undivided self. The sense that the modern self in India is split. And how does one reconcile this split is a 60-year-old concern that doesn't leave him. And it's, anyway, he handles it in different ways, of course. Not to suggest that it's manifest in the same way, but the foundational concern, I was struck to see remained the same. But our last speaker on the panel is Nithyananda Shetty. He's a professor of Kannada at Tumkur University. He's published 2 books, Marganveshane ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ, modern Kannada literary research. And he's also very, very interested in the Kannada Tudu literature interface. He also writes columns on political issues. Nithyananda.
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ನಾನು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲೇ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತೇನೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಐ ನೀಡ್ ನಾಟ್ ಬಿ ಅಪಾಲಜೆಟಿಕ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್. ನಾನು ಮೂಲತಃ ಹಳ್ಳಿಯಿಂದ ಬಂದವನು ಮತ್ತು ಈಗಲೂ ಹಳ್ಳಿಯಲ್ಲೇ ಇರುವವನು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಒಂದರ್ಥದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿದ್ದ ಹಾಗೆ. ಆದರೆ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಕರೆಸಿ ಬಹಳ ಹಗುರವಾದ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಸ್ಟೇಜಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂರಿಸಿ, ಬಹಳ ತೂಕದ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಗಳನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂರಿಸಿ ಈ ಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸನ್ನು ಇಂಬ್ಯಾಲೆನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ ತಮಾಷೆ ನೋಡುತ್ತಿರುವ ಚಂದನ್ ರಾಮಕೃಷ್ಣ ಹೆಗಡೆಯವರಿದ್ದ ಹಾಗೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅವರು ರಾಮಕೃಷ್ಣ ಹೆಗಡೆ ಚೇರ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಆಗಿ ಇರೋದು ಬಹಳ ಅನ್ವರ್ಥವಾಗಿ. ಇಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪುಸ್ತಕ ಮಾಡಿ ಇದರ ಕುರಿತ ಚರ್ಚೆಗೆ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ಗಳನ್ನು ಯಾಕೆ ಕರಿಬಾರ್ದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಅನುಭವ ಇವತ್ತು ಚಂದನಿಗೆ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಗುಂಡೂರ್ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ HS ರಾಘವೇಂದ್ರ ಆಲ್ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಒಂದು PhD ಥೀಸಿಸ್ನ ವೈವಾ ವರ್ಸನ್ ನಡೆಸಿಬಿಟ್ರು. ನೀವು ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವ್ ಮಾಡಿದರೆ ಅಂಜುಮ್ ಹಸನ್ ಅವರನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಅವರಿಬ್ಬರ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳು ಅಷ್ಟು ಶಾರ್ಪ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದು. ಅದು ಹೇಗಿತ್ತಂದರೆ ಚಂದನ್ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಮನು ಇಬ್ಬರು ಕೂಡ ನೋಟ್ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದವರು ಪ್ರಾಯಶಃ ಅವರು ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿರುವಾಗ ಎಷ್ಟು ನೋಟ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಇಲ್ವೋ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಇವತ್ತಂತೂ ಅಷ್ಟು ನೋಟ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅವರು. ಓಕೆ, ಈಗಷ್ಟೇ ಚಂದನ್ ಯಾಕೆ ಇದು ದ ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಎನ್ನುವುದು ನಮ್ಮ ಚಾಯ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲ, ದ ಫ್ರಾಗ್ರೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸುರಗಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಚಾಯ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಇನ್ ಕೇಸ್ ಆ ಹೆಸರಲ್ಲಿ ಇರ್ತಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನನ್ನದೊಂದು ಆಕ್ಷೇಪ ಇರ್ತಿತ್ತು. ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದ ಒಬ್ಬ ಬಹಳ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಇಂಟಲೆಕ್ಚುವಲ್ ಆದ, ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಲದ ಒಬ್ಬ ಬಹಳ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಆದಂತಹ ಒಬ್ಬ ಬರಹಗಾರನನ್ನು ಸುರಗಿಯ ಪರಿಮಳ ಎಂದು ರೊಮ್ಯಾಂಟಿಸೈಸ್ ಮಾಡೋದನ್ನು ನಾನು ಬಹಳ ಗಂಭೀರವಾಗಿ ಆಕ್ಷೇಪಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಮೂಲತಃ ಆಳವಾದ ಸೃಜನಶೀಲತೆಯನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿದ, ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟಿವ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದ, ಮೂಲತಃ ಪ್ರಾಧ್ಯಾಪಕನೂ ಮತ್ತು ಪ್ರಸಿದ್ಧ ಮಾತುಗಾರನೂ ಆಗಿದ್ದ, ವಿಶ್ವವಿದ್ಯಾನಿಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಕುಲಪತಿ, ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ಅಕಾಡೆಮಿ ಇಂಥ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಉನ್ನತ ಹುದ್ದೆಗಳನ್ನು ನಿರ್ವಹಿಸಿದ, ರಾಜಕಾರಣ, ಧರ್ಮ, ಪರಿಸರ, ಅಭಿವೃದ್ಧಿ, ಕೋಮುವಾದ ಇತ್ಯಾದಿ ವಿಷಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡದ ಜನಮಾನಸವನ್ನು ಮತ್ತೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ಎಚ್ಚರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದ ಮತ್ತು ಎಚ್ಚರಿಸುವುದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ತನ್ನ ಜೀವಮಾನ ಪೂರ್ತಿ ಒದ್ದಾಡಿದ, ವಸ್ತುಶಃ ಒದ್ದಾಡಿದ ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಎಂಬಂತಹ ಒಬ್ಬ ಧೀಮಂತ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಯ ಎಸೆನ್ಸನ್ನು ಹಿಡಿಯುವುದು ಮತ್ತು ಅದನ್ನು ಸಂಗ್ರಹಿಸುವುದು ಯಾರಿಗೇ ಆದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಹಳ ಚಾಲೆಂಜಿಂಗ್ ಆದಂಥ ಕೆಲಸಗಳೇ. ಸೊ ಈ ಎಸೆನ್ಸ್ ಮತ್ತು ಎಸೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಮಾತು ಬಂದಿರೋದರಿಂದ ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಹೆಚ್ಚು ವಿಸ್ತರಿಸೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಬಹಳ ಇಷ್ಟವಾದ ಮತ್ತು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಒಂದು ಕವನ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಮುಖ್ಯ ಲೇಖನ ಈ ಸಂಕಲನದಲ್ಲಿದೆ. ಪ್ರೀತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಕರ್ತವ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡದು ಎಂಬ ಲೇಖನ. ಆ ಕವನವನ್ನು ಇಲ್ಲಿರುವವರಿಗೆ ಭಾಳ ಜನರಿಗೆ ಅದು ಗೊತ್ತಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಆದರೂ ನನ್ನ ಸುಖಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ವಾಚನ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಒಂದು ಬೆಟ್ಟದ ತಪ್ಪಲಲ್ಲಿ ಗಾಂಧಿ ವಿಶ್ರಾಂತಿಗೆ ಅಂತ ತಂಗಿದ್ದಾಗ ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ ಪಡೆದ ಅನಿರೀಕ್ಷಿತ ಉತ್ತರದಿಂದಾಗಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಸಾಕ್ಷಾತ್ಕಾರವಾದುದನ್ನು ನನ್ನ ಅಪ್ಪ ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಒಬ್ಬ ಹುಡುಗಿ, ಚಿಕ್ಕವಳು, ಕಂಕುಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹುಷಾರಾಗಿ ಅಕ್ಕರೆಯಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಮಗುವನ್ನು ಎತ್ತಿಕೊಂಡು ಹುಡುಗಾಟಿಕೆಗೆ ಬರಿಗಾಲಲ್ಲಿ ಲಂಗದ ನಿರಿ ಚಿಮ್ಮುತ್ತ ಏದುಸಿರು ಬಿಡುತ್ತ ಗುಡ್ಡ ಹತ್ತಿ ಬರುತ್ತಿದ್ದಾಳೆ. ಬಿಸಿಲು ನೋಡಕ್ಕೆ ಲಕ್ಷಣವಾಗಿದ್ದಾಳೆ. ತೇಪೆ ಹಾಕಿದ ಲಂಗ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾಳೆ. ಬರೀ ಕತ್ತಿನ ಮೇಲೆ ಬಿದ್ದಿರೋ ಜಡೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೂ ಮುಡಿದಿದ್ದಾಳೆ. ಮರದ ನೆರಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತು ನೋಡುತ್ತಿದ್ದ ಗಾಂಧಿಗೆ ಕನಿಕರ ಉಕ್ಕಿ ಕೆಳಗಿಳಿದು ಹೋಗಿ ಕೇಳುತ್ತಾರೆ, ಭಾರವೇನಮ್ಮ? ಹುಡುಗಿ ನಡೀತಾನೆ ಒಂದು ಕಂಕುಳಿಂದ ಇನ್ನೊಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಕ್ಕರೆಯಿಂದ ಹುಷಾರಾಗಿ ಗಿಲುವಾಗಿ ಮಗುನ ಬದಲಾಯಿಸಿ ಹೇಳುತ್ತಾಳೆ, ಇವನು ನನ್ನ ತಮ್ಮ. ಈ ಕವನ ಈ ಸಂಕಲನದಲ್ಲಿ ನನಗೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಕವನ ಆಯ್ತಂದರೆ, ನಾನು ಈ ಕವನವನ್ನು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರ ಆ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಚರ್ಚಿತವಾದ ಮತ್ತು ಅವರ ಅನೇಕ ಗೆಳೆಯರಿಂದ ಅವರು ಪ್ರತಿರೋಧವನ್ನು ಎದುರಿಸಬೇಕಾಗಿ ಬಂದ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಲೇಖನದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಇಟ್ಟು ನೋಡುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ನಮಗೆ ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯವಾಗಿ ನಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ, ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಬದುಕನ್ನು ನಾವು ಎರವಲು ಪಡೆದುಕೊಂಡ ಪಶ್ಚಿಮದ ಚೌಕಟ್ಟುಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ನಮ್ಮದೇ ಆದ ಮೆಥಡಲಾಜಿಕಲ್ ಆದ ಗ್ರಿಡ್ಗಳನ್ನು ನಾವು ಕಂಡುಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕು ಎಂಬ ಒಂದು ದೃಷ್ಟಿಕೋನ ಅದು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿಯೂ ಕೂಡ ಸರಿಯಾದ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಕೋನವೇ ಹೌದು. ಆದರೆ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಲೇಖನದಲ್ಲಿ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ಎತ್ತುವ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ನನ್ನ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ನಮಗೆ ಬರಿಗಣ್ಣಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣದ್ದನ್ನು ಕಾಣಿಸುವ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಅವರು ಆ ಲೇಖನದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಈಗ ಈ ಕವನ ಪ್ರೀತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಕರ್ತವ್ಯ ಎನ್ನುವ ಈ ಕವನ ನನಗೆ ಈ ಲೇಖನದ ಹಿನ್ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಇದು ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತದಂದರೆ, ಗಾಂಧಿಗೆ ಆ ಹುಡುಗಿ ಅವಳ ತಮ್ಮನನ್ನು ಎತ್ತಿಕೊಂಡದ್ದು ಭಾರ ಅಂತ ಅನಿಸಿದರೆ, ಆ ಹುಡುಗಿಗೆ ಅವನನ್ನು ಎತ್ತಿಕೊಂಡದ್ದು ಅದು ಪ್ರೀತಿಯಾಗಿದೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅದು ಹಗುರವಾಗಿದೆ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಘಟನೆಯನ್ನು ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತೇವೋ ಅದನ್ನು ಅನುಭವಿಸುವವರು ಅದನ್ನು ನಮ್ಮ ಭಾವದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಬೇಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಎನ್ನುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಲೇಖನ ನನಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ನಾನು ತುಳುನಾಡಿನಿಂದ ಬಂದವನು, ಕರಾವಳಿಯಿಂದ ಬಂದವನು. ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿರಿಯ ಆರಾಧನೆ ಇದೆ. ಸಿರಿಯ ಕಥೆ, ಸಿರಿಯ ಸಂಧಿ ಮತ್ತು ಸಿರಿಯ ಆರಾಧನೆಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತೆ ಸಾಕಷ್ಟು ಫೆಮಿನಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಫ್ರೇಮ್ವರ್ಕ್ಗಳ ಮೂಲಕ ಅಧ್ಯಯನಗಳು ನಡೆದಿವೆ. ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದ್ದ ಹಾಗೆ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆಯ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹಾಗೆ ಅಧ್ಯಯನ ನಡೆದುದು ಎಲ್ಲವೂ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದರೆ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ನಮಗೆ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆಯನ್ನು ನಾವು ನೋಡಬೇಕಾದ, ನಾವು ಅರ್ಥೈಸಬೇಕಾದ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಮಾರ್ಗವನ್ನು ತೋರಿಸ್ತಾರೆ. ಅಂದರೆ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲಿ ಇನ್ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ರಿಸ್ಕನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡು ತನ್ನ ಗೆಳೆಯರ, ತನ್ನ ಅಭಿಮಾನಿಗಳ ವಿರೋಧವನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಳ್ಳಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತದೆ ಎನ್ನುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ರಿಸ್ಕನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡು ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ಈ ಸತ್ಯವನ್ನು ಹೇಳುವ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಸತ್ಯವನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಕೇವಲ ಅಧಿಕಾರಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಮಾತ್ರ ಅಲ್ಲ, ತನ್ನ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಬದುಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಂತಹ ಜನಸಮುದಾಯಕ್ಕೂ ಕೂಡ ಎನ್ನುವುದು ನನಗೆ ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯದಾಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಕುರ್ತಕೋಟಿಯವರದೇ ಒಂದು ಮಾತು, ಕಂಡದ್ದರ ಬಲದ ಮೇಲೆ ಕಣ್ಣಿಗೆ ಕಾಣದ್ದನ್ನು ಕಾಣಿಸುವವನೇ ಸಂಶೋಧಕ ಅಂತ. ಆದರೆ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿ ಅದನ್ನು ತಾನು ಕಂಡದ್ದರ ಬಲದ ಮೇಲೆ ಜನಸಮುದಾಯದ ಕಣ್ಣಿಗೆ ಯಾವುದು ಕಂಡಿಲ್ಲವೋ ಅದನ್ನು ಕಾಣಿಸುವ ಒಬ್ಬ ತತ್ವಜ್ಞಾನಿಯ, ಒಬ್ಬ ಫಿಲಸಾಫರ್ನ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಅವರು ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರು. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಕವನ ಅಂದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಕವನ, ಅದು ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಚಂದನ್ಗೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಶೇರ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ನಾನು ಆ ಕವನ ನನಗೆ ದೆಹಲಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ರೈತರ ಕಾಯ್ದೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟಂತೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಂದ ಸುಗ್ರೀವಾಜ್ಞೆಗೆ ವಿರೋಧವಾಗಿ ರೈತರು ನಡೆಸಿದ ಹೋರಾಟದ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ನನಗೆ ಬಹಳ ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಕವನವಾಗಿ ಕಂಡಿತ್ತು. ನಾನೊಂದು ಲೇಖನವನ್ನು ಬರೆದೆ, ಅದನ್ನು ಮುಂದೆ ಕೂತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ವಿವೇಕ್ ಶಾನ್ಬಾಗ್, ಅವರಿಗೆ ಕಳಿಸಿದ್ದೆ. ತಕ್ಷಣ ವಿವೇಕ್ ನನಗೆ ರಿಪ್ಲೈ ಬರೆದ್ರು, ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ಬದುಕಿರ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಅವರು ಈ ಲೇಖನವನ್ನು ಓದಿ ಬಹಳ ಸಂಭ್ರಮ ಪಡ್ತಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ. ಆ ಕವನ ಹೀಗಿದೆ. ಈ ಕವನವೂ ಕೂಡ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡೋದು ಎನ್ನುವ ಲೇಖನದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಸತ್ತು ಬದುಕಿ ಊರು, ಸೋತು ಗೆದ್ದು ದೇಶ, ಒಳದಾರಿ ತುಳಿದು ಊರು, ಹೆದ್ದಾರಿ ತಿಳಿದು ದೇಶ, ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಿ ಇರೋದು ಊರು, ಗುರಿಯಾಗಿ ಉಳಿಯುವುದು ದೇಶ. ಎಣ್ಣಿ ಎಣ್ಣಿ ಊರು, ಎಣಿಸಿ ಎಣಿಸಿ ದೇಶ, ಹರಟಿ ಊರು, ಸ್ತುತಿಸಿ ದೇಶ. ಒಂದು ಮಮತೆಗೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಘನತೆಗೆ ಬದುಕಿದ್ದು ಊರು, ಭಾವಿಸಿದ್ದು ದೇಶ. ಒಂದು ಕಥೆ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಇತಿಹಾಸ. ಈ ಕವನ ಈ ಸಂಕಲನದಲ್ಲಿ ಇರಬೇಕಿತ್ತು ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಯಾಕೆ ಬಯಸೋದಂದರೆ, ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಮಾಡಿದ ಹೆಣ್ಣುಮಕ್ಕಳು, ಸಣ್ಣ ಮಕ್ಕಳು, ದೊಡ್ಡವರು, ಗಂಡಸರು, ಇವರೆಲ್ಲರದ್ದು ಊರು. ಅದನ್ನು ವಿರೋಧಿಸಿದ ವಿಚಾರವಾದಿಗಳದ್ದು, ಸ್ತ್ರೀವಾದಿಗಳದ್ದು ದೇಶ. ಒಂದು ಊರಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನಂತಹ ಜನರು ಇರ್ತಾರೆ. ಆದರೆ ಒಂದು ದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಫಂಡಮೆಂಟಲಿಸ್ಟ್ಗಳು, ಸೆಕ್ಯುಲರಿಸ್ಟ್ಗಳು, ರ್ಯಾಷನಲಿಸ್ಟ್ಗಳು, ಫೆಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ಗಳು ಇರ್ತಾರೆ. ಈ ಕವನವನ್ನು ಚಂದನ್ ಮತ್ತು ಮನು ಅವರಿಬ್ಬರೂ ಕೂಡ ಒಳಗೊಂಡಿರ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಮತ್ತು ಅದರ ಇಡೀ ಸೀಕ್ವೆನ್ಸನ್ನು ಬದಲಾಯಿಸಿ ಬೆತ್ತಲೆ ಪೂಜೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಕೂಡದು ಕವನದ ಮೊದಲು ಒಂದು ಕವನ ಮತ್ತು ನಂತರ ಈ ಕವನ ಇರ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಈ ಸಂಕಲನ ಕೊಡುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಅರ್ಥವೇ ಬೇರೆ ಇರೋದು. ಬಟ್ ನನಗೆ ಒಂದಂತೂ ಖಾತ್ರಿ ಇದೆ, ಈ ಸಂಕಲನದ ಮೂಲಕ ಪುನರ್ಜನ್ಮ ಇದೆಯೋ ಇಲ್ವೋ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ಅನಂತಮೂರ್ತಿಯವರು ಮತ್ತೆ ನಮ್ಮ ನಡುವೆ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಫಾರ್ ಇಟ್.
Thank you, Nithyananda. I just thank you, Nithyananda. I will convey the essentials, the word that is enjoying a strange presence today. He said he actually would not have liked the title The Fragrant Suragi because it would not convey to us the activist, political, the engaged writer. I think that's a fair objection. Manu may differ. Nithyananda said, as a teacher, orator, and someone who held a variety of public offices, he spoke on issues of religion, development, politics, and tried to alert the Kannada audience to these issues. And that was something very important. And then he went on to talk about a poem in the anthology here that meant a lot to him called Love and Duty. And I thank you, I had not thought of the connection. It's a fascinating connection. I mean, again, I'll try to summarize the poem. So Gandhi sees this young girl coming up the hill and he's sitting beneath a tree and he notices she's carrying a child and he wonders if it's proving burdensome. And he asks her if it's proving a burden. She said, no, she passes the child from one shoulder to the other and says, no, he's my brother. And he was saying, do the activists, do the theoreticians who want to intervene, to change, to reform practices that they find illiberal, that they find objectionable, are they trying to place a burden on those who are experiencing those things lightly, in the sense who may not be feeling it as a strain, but which appears to be this extraordinary sense of problem through the eyes of reform, liberal reform? That's an important hypothesis. We need to think about it at length. But the contrast is important. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that essay, Why Not Worship in the Nude? It's an important essay. One of the things that I try to say in the introduction is Ananthamurthy's writings, preempted is probably a weak thing, but it very strongly robust anticipation, not anticipation, a formulation of many of the things that post-colonial studies pretended to have stumbled upon for the first time. I mean, this is absolutely a scandal, actually. The kinds of forgetting that we find in academic bibliographies, that you compile Edward Said and on. That's the post-colonial memory, more or less. But you find Indian writers, Ananthamurthy being one of them, who have actually raised fundamental doubts about the possibilities of or difficulties of representing experiences through liberal frames. So he tried to say that if, in that essay, talking about cultural rationalities actually, a rationality of worship that doesn't see worshipping in the nude as a problem, but which comes to then be seen through the eyes of the urbanites or the reformers for different reasons, as something to stop or something to commercially exploit, both of which are wrong. So Ananthamurthy's essay was making a plea that experiences that appear unfamiliar and strange to you, objectionable, offensive, may have their own inner rationality and dignity, which you in your eagerness to promote egalitarianism may be not being sufficiently sensitive to. So yes, I will and he actually read out a poem that is not in the anthology. It's an interesting poem, again, a binaristic comparison between a village and a nation. Uru is untranslatable. It could be village, it could be city. It's a place where you live, essentially. And a series of contrasts between what it means to live in a village/city and what it means to think like someone who belongs to a country, nation. So it's essentially, do you think of yourself as a member of a society or a member of a nation? Then different priorities kick in. And the nation brings with it violent, or kinds of compulsions that usually are of a harder, militant kind, can pose deep problems to the other world of experience. I shall stop here, and I realize it's 8:12. We have 20 minutes, and Gundur has raised a series of questions, but we shall open it up to the audience now, and then maybe respond to them later. Based on what you've heard, and we have seen the book, what you've seen inside, questions to anyone?
So against the same background, Bettale Puja Eke Kudadu, when he wrote in Kannada, it was so, the title itself was crafted in such a way, those of us who read only the title, Bettale Puja Eke Kudadu, Bettale Puja should not be there. Or Bettale Puja Eke Kudadu. It is a question that he tries to justify. Yeah? So against this background that you argued, recently there was a debate on Madesnana also. Some of them justifying it and some opposing it. So how do you, these dichotomies, how do you negotiate this as a background? Yeah? So that is my question.
Thank you, Shashi. I think something like Madesnana, do you need the constitution to see it as objectionable and say that this looks demeaning and this should be stopped? Or do you look for conversations within the tradition, which no one had the patience to look for, to see if that practice may have been abhorrent even at the time it originated, and to see how they may have seen it as abhorrent? But if nothing is available, then you try to make an argument in a way that doesn't seem alien to those practicing it. I mean, this is the work of creative intervention. It requires patience, it requires creativity, but I'm saying there are ways of calling it an unacceptable practice.
See, somebody from the West, if you just extrapolate it to the larger questions of colonialism, somebody from the West may also kind of extend the logic and then justify, if people are ruled, if they're colonized, if they're happy, be it in Africa or in Asian countries, if they're being ruled, if they're happy, then so be it. The argument can go likewise as
Except
well.
that colonialism from day one has its opponents from various angles, the liberal Raja Ram Mohan Roy to a variety of other kinds of objections. But you're right, if there's no objection, what do you do is a question to think of.
The way, for example, Gandhi, he comes and then recognizes what is the real dimension of colonialism, internal, external, or Ambedkar or Gandhi. So they point out and then, this is wrong, this is morally wrong, and socially wrong, politically wrong. And then there is some resistance and then opposition to colonialism that we all see in various forms.
Yes.
So this is the question. If somebody is, it can be used both ways. It is a kind of, the argument is in a way double-edged sword. I'll ask Manu sir also to respond. Yeah, request.
Do you want to say? I don't think it's a double-edged sword, but let Manu say.
No, just a very obvious point about whose tradition are we talking about? There isn't a unified tradition, apart from the Western influence. Within India also there are multiple. So, either about Bettale Puja or about, what is, I'm sorry, I don't know the Kannada word for that, the snana, the rolling through the Madesnana. So, I mean, I'm sure many of the people who were rolling through it might also object. So, but there is a tradition of that, and so, whose tradition are you talking about when you say that there isn't that oppositional voice?
Yeah, also extrapolating it, you could take sati, right? What is the degree to which a certain subjection is tolerable, and whether the individual who is a practitioner, I mean, who is forced to practice it, has a voice at all? Yeah.
Can you please restate that?
I said, such a binary can be extrapolated to extremes such as sati, right? So, what kind of an argument can we provide in such a context?
Sir, ಗದ್ಯಕ್ಕೋ ಪದ್ಯಕ್ಕೋ 3 ಮೇಜರ್ ಡಿಫರೆನ್ಸಸ್ ಏನು? ಎರಡನೇ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ, ಕನ್ನಡದಿಂದ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ಗಾಗಲಿ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷಿಂದ ಕನ್ನಡಕ್ಕೆ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಕೆಲವು ಈಕ್ವಲೆಂಟ್ ವರ್ಡ್ಸು ಸಿಗೋದು ಕಷ್ಟ. ಭಾವಗಳನ್ನ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ how much you are free to sacrifice and what depth of knowledge you should have. For example, one simple word, Angelo. How do you translate this? ಭಾವನೆನೂ ಬರಬೇಕು, ಅರ್ಥಗರ್ಭಿತವಾಗೂ ಇರಬೇಕು. Please explain on this and inform us, please. Translation is important, sir. I don't agree with that.
No, that's
Worldwide, books are translated. How a guy in Gowda will understand if it is in other language which he doesn't know? That's very important. Translation is the key for spreading the knowledge. I just don't believe that. Thank you, sir.
I just have just a question of curiosity, and now I'm really intrigued as to why the editors did include Betale Puje, the poem about the Betale Puje, because simply given today's context, where sometimes intervention of a certain kind has become essential. So just if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, to start with Usha's question first, you really should read it to see how he's navigating the very complex issue like that. Because he's in dialogue with a modern day an anthropologist, social worker who wants it to be stopped. And he's trying to say why that may not be the only way of responding to it. And that was a way of disclosing there are different life worlds which may appear to you to be completely abhorrent. But then there is a world of meaning inside that for those practicing it. And the problem, it became a controversy because it became, some kind of a voyeuristic tourism. People would show up there with their cameras and exploit them, etc., etc. Those were the things that he felt had to be stopped, but not the worship itself. But, yeah. Yeah. No, this was why I included it, because I thought it showed a style of thinking that we don't know. There is side-taking normally, but I think there's a kind of bearing of complexity. It's a very hesitant reasoning. I'm not saying it's, if you look at it, he's very, very aware that it's not going to be easy to write this thing. The other question, the translation is Chandragutil Neditilla. It's stopped from what I know. I mean, Gautam's question, what tradition, if this practice is in the Kukke Subramanya temple, so we'll need to get a sense for, see, the thing is local things become national things, and intervening has to be at that level where the practitioners are involved, both the temple that allows for it and those who do it. So we need to get a sense of, how it evolved, and, if the temple management itself has had an ambivalent relationship with this, which we don't get a sense for in the newspaper coverage at least. But let's imagine the worst case scenario. The temple loves the fact that it's happening and the practitioners have been doing it also willingly, what then? And I think here there is no one cut and dried answer. Imaginative responses. Gandhi would have done something else, and someone else would have done something else. But the thing is, it has to seem like, the fact of responding, that's almost a creative act of intervening. I mean, how do you do it without seeming like a self-righteous stand from outside? What are your stakes in it? Are you a human rights champion from Paris talking? Or is it someone who actually believes in the stakes of worship, but you nevertheless think something has to be changed there? I think there are ways of doing that. Yeah.
Because even within the local, you have a power equation within which many of these practices are taking place. So you have the local and you have the global in the global sense.
True.
You have the local and the global in the local sense.
Yes.
How would you address this?
Yeah.
ಅಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು ಬಹಳ ಸರಳವಾದ ವಿಷಯನ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಕಾಂಪ್ಲಿಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣರು ಊಟ ಮಾಡಿದ ಎಂಜಿಲೆಲೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಹೊರಲಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಪುಣ್ಯ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತನೋ ಪಾಪ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತನೋ ಆರ್ಗ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ, ಯಾರಾದ್ರು ನಂಬಿದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ಸಬ್ಕಾನ್ಷಿಯಸ್ ಒಳಗೂ ಅದು ಸೇರಿ ಹೋಗಿದೆ. ಅದು ಯಾಕೆ ಸೇರಿತು ಅನ್ನೋ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಹೈರಾರ್ಕಿಕಲ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ, ಹೌ ಡಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಂಪೋಸ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಓನ್ ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂಸ್ ಈವನ್ ದ ಸಬ್ಕಾನ್ಷಿಯಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಆರ್ಡರಿ people belonging to other lower castes? This is a simple thing and nothing much to discuss about, at least as far as I can see.
I think it's important because if you're actually in that binary, you have a local and the global. I'm saying the local is perceived from a power perspective here.
Yeah.
Okay? To perpetuate particular practice which has been imposed by a particular place in the power hierarchy. So that is something. So when you say local and global, I mean the binary, where you can have smaller binaries, and there you can look at the power structures as they have formed. And therefore, I mean, we'll have to look at that as well, rather than, just Uru and Desha.
Yes. Yeah. But Manu? Yes. Enduring legacy. Should we collect a few more questions and then just stick to the panel? We have 5 minutes.
I thought I would address each of the panelists, but that might take some 10 to 15 minutes, and I don't know if it's right to do that.
But since they've already raised, just answer that question and then we'll come to
No, what's the impact is for the future to decide.
No,
So
as of now, what is this enduring legacy, Manu? Intellectual legacy?
Well,
Or political legacy?
it endures in many ways, very complex ways, and the most important point about Ananthamurthy is here is a man, a thinker, a writer who runs against himself. That was what I was trying to say. A man who is not afraid of running against himself. Now, as far as that question about the Bethele Puja, nude worship is concerned, my own point is it's an anti-modernist critique without justifying anything. The most important thing is when you take on several opponents, several opposing forces, you answer them, you counter them without really legitimizing anything. That's the kind of ambivalence that Ananthamurthy displays. If you turn to that essay in particular, there's the sociologist, there's the anthropologist, there's the psychoanalyst, there's the feminist activist, and the basic question, as I have read the essay, as I have dealt with the essays, he's raising a fundamental question about what right does anybody have, in an ethical sense, what right does anybody have to intervene when people see myths, mythologies as lived experiences, as experiential realities. Today as the debate is going on about this uniform civil code, the tribal communities are very unsettled. So how do we intervene? How do we deal with the rationalities, and who decides what is rational, what is not rational, what is oppressive? These are very complex questions. In fact, Nithyananda Shetty talked of Vuru Desha, the contrast is not just between Vuru Desha, which is what Shankar was trying to say, but if you turn to a Dalit writer like Sidlinga, he will talk of Vuru Mattu Keri, of the ghetto, shall we say. So there are complexities built into all these issues connected. Now, that's why Ananthamurthy, take any stage, this is my submission to Professor H.S. Raghavendra Rao. Right from the beginning till the end, Ananthamurthy was journeying. In fact, it was a very important creative cultural peregrination between the modernist, rationalist, secular position and a counter-rationalist, shall we even say anti-secular, anti-rationalist position. So if you look at this, there's a constant juxtaposition within his body of works between one set of perspectives to counter perspectives. Now, Chandan and I were trying to point out to these counter perspectives. But essentially, Gundur, you refer to Heidegger. In fact, Ananthamurthy was constantly, did not write about it, was constantly referring to Heidegger, even in our classes 45 years ago, and pointed out that eventually Heidegger turned not to philosophy, not to the Western philosophical tradition, being one of the most important dimensions of Western philosophical tradition. He turned to Johann Christian Friedrich Hölderlin, because he said ultimately there is something more important than philosophy, than intellectual, ideological positions, and that is the struggle to find expression to the ineffable, what cannot be articulated. So with all these difficulties that we have with Ananthamurthy, the whole point is that Ananthamurthy was constantly trying to use ideas, which was what Professor Raghavendra Rao tried to point out, in a very poetic manner, not a rigorous intellectual, and he did not have to be a rigorous intellectual. He used Marx, he used Lohia, he used everybody, but it came out of his poetic impulses of envisioning a society which was based on very solid democratic foundations. That's why Anjum. Now, when you refer to Edmund Burke, there are two Edmund Burkes. The first one who dismissed the French Revolution on the revolution in France, but the same Edmund Burke, because this is what we learned in the literary criticism classes 45 years ago. Ananthamurthy pointed out, and I went to that essay, the same Edmund Burke as a conservative, he begins as a conservative, but writes the next essay, Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he says, these are the lines from Edmund Burke, whoever attempts to resist modern forces, whoever, such a person is not firm and resolute, but obstinate and perverse. In fact, Matthew Arnold makes a comment that this is the return of Burke. So this is moving from the age of concentration, consolidation of conservatism to a more liberal, radical position. Well, what does Ananthamurthy mean during these times? In spite of your objection to Suragi, let me say why Suragi becomes important. Tagore, Gandhi, Tagore's Gora and nationalism were central to Ananthamurthy. Central to Ananthamurthy because during these very difficult times, very dark times, sinister times, the caste system was very different. But Ananthamurthy saw the greatest threat, as Gandhi did, was this anti-Muslim communal consciousness, which he really believed would destroy India. And two things were most important for him: to attack nationalism, so directly borrowing from Hind Swaraj and Tagore's text nationalism, and this whole notion of purity of caste, purity of race, the genealogy of race. So Ananthamurthy constantly turned to Gora, Tagore's Gora. Now this was sustaining for him, and therefore the most important text for Ananthamurthy, and that's why he wrote it. Of course, he did not live to see it published, was Hindutva or Hind Swaraj. So if you look at these things, if India is going to survive these monstrous times, the last 10 years have been monstrous, hideous. It's only when you begin to look at sources of fragrance that the flower will not die. And there Octavio Paz was important. When Octavio Paz says, we must learn how to say no to history, the history of brutality, the history of all this anti-human consciousness. And so I'm not even trying to defend anything, but trying to show how we positioned ourselves. That we were trying to run Ananthamurthy against himself, because that's the creed of his creative and intellectual position. Never hesitant to turn against himself. So even, sir, when you turn to the Navya phase, Samakshama, Pragne, Mattu Parisara, if you turn to those texts, but turn to the later works, he even turns to very, very important creative pieces, creative explorations like Valmiki and Nevadalli. It's all about creativity. And so there is this mixture in Ananthamurthy, a conscious mixture of moving in one direction and running against that direction. So is he a Navya writer? He's a Navya writer, but you cannot dub him a Navya writer. In relation to modernity, tradition, secularism, myths, beliefs, rationalities, you have multiple Ananthamurthys. So we were trying to assemble those pieces which would enable people like you, enlighten people like you, to raise questions about the choice of the pieces themselves. And that, I think, is the real tribute to Ananthamurthy.
Fights. Let's talk about the fights.
Collaboration, the taller Chandan was always the leader, literally and metaphorically. But one more thing I would like to end with is to return. And if there was a dilemma that Ananthamurthy was not able to resolve, not just in relation to the caste system, but about the choices of India, he turned to another important figure, Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin, talking of the liberal predicament. Now, he was a Zionist, Isaiah Berlin. Let's not hide the fact. In fact, he went out of the way to ask Guardian to suppress the political writings of Chomsky and Edward Said. That's a different matter. But notwithstanding his enormous scholarship, but Isaiah Berlin returns to the Russian masters, fathers and sons, and asks, how do we deal with, because we learned Isaiah Berlin through Ananthamurthy, how do we deal with questions of democracy, liberty, fraternity, equality, all that enlightenment? How do we support them without attacking violence? Without attacking violence of those who are fighting for liberty, justice, and equality. Which means, as Isaiah Berlin takes up that position, the first duty of a serious ethical intellectual is to attack the violence of the state, the violence of the perpetrator, and then raise questions. So he was sympathetic to militants, not terrorists. That's the favorite word of these monsters, murderers. But anyway, the whole point is, how do you fight on behalf of those who have to resort to violence without philosophically legitimizing violence? And these are not questions that are going to be answered in very simple terms. So run into difficulties, run into conflicts, and make sure that you take up this position, that you don't end up saying that I have all final answers to the complex problems of history. Historical problems are not going to be resolved so easily. So we kept this going, and he led the way, and he gave me kindly light, so he led it. That's the collaboration.
Many more things to say. Should we stop here? I had just one comment on Anjum's eclecticism versus dialectic comment. I think they go together. The dialectic is foregrounded, but the rest of it is all eclectically picked. If you look for sources of where these things are coming from, we can see it's from A, B, C, D, E sources, but they're really...
I mean, his openness
canvas,
is just incredible. Yeah. Even like a simple thing in the interview you do at the end where he says a new face every day. I thought that's a beautiful metaphor for how open-minded he was till the end. But just one tiny comment about the essay, Why Not Worship in the Nude. I think it's best read, Manu, to take your point about the sort of living with contradictions and living with the difficulty of resolving, not seeking to resolve. I think the best companion piece to that is tradition and creativity.
Yes.
Because that is saying the tradition is not its own justification ever.
Yeah.
Right? He's saying that, you know, you could be enchanted by the peasant who takes a stone and puts vermilion on it and says, this is God. That's an incredible act of faith. But immediately he pulls back and says, but is it enough? Do we want him to stagnate in that belief, or do we want him to be creative and question it? Right? So even though he, like you said, there's this 60-year-old tussle with the fragmented modernist self, I think it's a very, it's, in a way it's irresolvable, because the minute you introduce creativity, you are introducing fracture.
Yes.
You are introducing questioning. So how do you reconcile both? I don't think it's possible.
I think it's a form of consciousness. There's a fracture is hidden successfully by a poet or by an artist. And that's the, I think, but Gundur, I think Samskara can actually match Marquez, that novel, and in terms of whatever levels you would wish to, in its narrative strength or its metaphoric reach. I mean, they're two, it's, what are we comparing? They're two different contexts, but at some broad level of literary virtue, if you want to examine, okay, can you put it alongside a Marquez text? I would very confidently nominate Samskara for that exercise. And the other point about ambition that both of you mentioned, please remember this is for the general reader, and not saying the general readers cannot handle ambition, but there were explicit instructions to keep the introduction extremely simple. But I think the introduction does give you a sense for the movement of a writer and his concerns across the Navya and the post-Navya phase. May not have done it with the kind of layering that you may have wanted to see. His Rujavatu writings and his other kinds of writings don't figure here. But I still feel it's not a static picture. I think but I really love the spirit of the combativeness of Gundur, because this is so absent. Most discussions tend to be sweet, and sweet in the sense of, privileging courtesy over everything else. And I think it's important to ask tough questions. What kind of, the Heidegger question, what forms does this thought take, is something that is worth exploring at length. Because that is something he would have cared for. With that, but thank you all for sitting with us for this long, patiently. And thank you all panelists for their time. Thank you.